I think I'll start. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is the sixth of seven panels entitled "For Palestine: Analyzing Settler Colonialism and the Return of Fascism." This series has been co-organized by AUB's Critical Approaches to Development Studies, the Program of Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts, and the Center for Arts and Humanities. Our two speakers this evening are Dr. Cy Englert, who is Assistant Professor in the Institute for Area Studies, Leiden University. And Cy's research focuses on the Israeli state, its changing relationship with the labor movement, and the consequences of the neoliberal transition. He also works on settler colonialism and settler labor movements more generally. He is the author of a book entitled Settler Colonialism: An Introduction, published by Pluto Press in 2022. And he's written numerous articles about Israel and Palestine and political economy. And his work has appeared in Historical Materialism, Middle East Critique, the Journal of Palestine Studies, Jacobin, Salvage, and the New Left Review. I'll also introduce our second speaker for this evening, who is Dr. Toufic Haddad. Toufic is director of the Council for British Research in the Levant's Kenyon Institute in Jerusalem. His work focuses on the political economy of development and conflict in the Middle East and Israel-Palestine in particular. Toufic is the author of Palestine Limited: Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories, published by IB Tauris in 2016. And he is also co-author and editor of Between the Lines: Readings in Israel, the Palestinians, and the US War on Terror, published by Haymarket Books in 2007, and co-author of Towards a New Internationalism: Readings in Globalization, the Global Justice Movement, and Palestinian Liberation, which was published in Arabic by Muwatin Press in 2006. So today, Cy will be our first speaker, and I believe he'll speak for roughly 20-25 minutes, and then he'll be followed by Toufic immediately after. So please, Cy, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thanks also to Nadia, to Rima, and to all the other organizers for putting this wonderful series together, for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here, and a real pleasure to be able to meet with all of you in a period in which I think one of the few specks of light that we can generate are in the moments and the places in which we gather to discuss, to strategize, to understand, and to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So what I'll try to do today is to talk about obviously the theme of our meeting, labor, settler colonialism, and political economy, but to think about the kind of the current moment through the longer history of labor and settler colonialism in Palestine. And what I want to try to do specifically is to think about what we have come to call the Gaza Strip, and how it emerges out of several rounds of Israeli colonial assaults, and is the outcome really of Israeli settler colonial policy. And I think it's important in terms of how we think about the present, both to make sense of what is currently happening in Palestine in general, and to the Palestinians in Gaza in particular, but also to think about the future. And I think the kind of the different ways in which the Israeli state, despite its military superiority, is also faced with a number of political contradictions that I think lie at the heart of its colonial project, lie at the heart of its um, existence and political life, and don't disappear simply, if I can say it like that, because of the overwhelming military violence it's able to unleash on the people of Palestine. And I also think it's important, and perhaps less for the people in this call, but I think there's a tendency in which Gaza or the Gaza Strip is discussed in policy, in the media, in public debate as a self-contained, logical, geographic kind of area, sometimes almost as an independent state that is in conflict with another. And instead, I want to kind of think about how the emergence of the Gaza Strip is the outcome of long-running first Zionist and then Israeli strategies of how to concentrate Palestinians in as little land as possible in order to make Zionist colonization possible. And I think this is important because while today the question of Israel as a settler colonial state is one that is sort of energetically debated and fought over, this was certainly not the case in the early years of the Zionist movement. In fact, until very late, up until the 1960s, and really the kind of the rise of anti-colonial movements across the global South, the Zionist movement describes itself very self-consciously as a colonial movement, and even describes its dispossession of Palestinians within its own borders after 1948 as the advancement of colonization. There's lots of kind of evidence of this, starting with Herzl's discussions in the Jewish state, in which he talks about how to make the book he writes in 1896, how to make colonization possible in Palestine. It continues with the establishment of the Zionist organization and the creation of the Jewish Colonial Trust that was to fund settlement in Palestine. It's visible in the early settlements in Palestine. The first collective farms are called moshavim in Hebrew, coming from the Hebrew word for colony. The Yishuv, which is the Jewish community in Palestine before 48, is called the Yishuv because it means settlement in 48, etc., etc., etc. All of this to say that the Zionist movement is extremely clear about its own role as a colonial movement, and because of that is also extremely clear about the central contradiction of that colonial movement, which is what to do with the populations that are already in the land that is to be colonized. And these debates are extremely visible, extremely violent in the early Zionist movement between different factions of the Zionist movement, as well as, of course, against the Palestinians. And the central question, which to me remains the central question running throughout or through Israeli policymaking, is how to deal with the Palestinians, so that while people will be familiar with the Zionist slogan that it was a movement for a people without a land and a land without a people. The Zionist movement was, of course, extremely clear about the existence of a people in the land and the need to deal with them. And there's two, I think, broad tendencies that can be identified that can broadly be read along class lines. So on the one hand, there is a more bourgeois wing in the Zionist movement, which argues that the future state that the Zionists will build should be modeled on a number of colonial experiences, and one of those that comes back is that of the French in Algeria. So this bourgeois wing of the Zionist movement will say, like the French in Algeria, our aim should be to be a minority of landowners that will exploit a majority of Palestinian workers in order to create cheap exportable goods for European markets. And that is the way in which the state will have a sustainable economic basis on which it can develop itself. Against that, there will be a labor Zionist movement, and the labor Zionist movement will be extremely important in the history of Zionism. We can talk about it more perhaps in the Q&A. It will rule it will rule the institutions of the Zionist movement from, let's say, the late 1920s all the way to 1977, when it loses its first election inside of Israel. And the kind of founding logic of that movement will be an opposition to that model of bourgeois Zionism. So they will say to build a state and an economy on the exploitation of the indigenous labor of the indigenous population would be to dig our own grave. One of the examples that the theorists of the labor Zionist movement will come back to repeatedly in the 1920s is South Africa. They will look at South Africa, and so again, you see this kind of extremely self-conscious understanding of themselves as a colonial movement. They look at Algeria, they look at South Africa, they look at other colonial states as a model. And South Africa will be used negatively by the labor Zionist movement to say, look at South Africa and the catastrophe that it represents for the colonial movement, because it's a colonial movement that is based on the exploitation of the majority of the indigenous population, of the African population, giving that African population the ability to rebel, to go on strike, to fight back, as indigenous populations always do. And by doing that, disorganizing, weakening, undermining the stability of both the colonial economy and the colonial state. And that question will be at the heart of the campaign that will really form the labor Zionist movement, which is the campaign for Hebrew labor, as it was known, also known as the conquest of labor, and that will be organized by the kind of institutions of the labor Zionist movement. Many of those institutions are famous today, perhaps none as much as the kibbutz, the collective farm, often celebrated as a sort of a socialist paradise, where European and North American youth went in the 60s and 70s to work on collective farms without managers, where people collectively decided over their labor. What is erased out of the history of the kibbutz in that rendition is that the kibbutz was the first collective farm in which the labor Zionist movement did away with the double threat. So the kibbutz doesn't have managers or owners because it was trying to do away with Palestinian workers. And so the kibbutz is the first form where the Palestinian worker is eliminated out of the Zionist economy in the early decades of the 20th century. And the kibbutz is going to stay important in the story also of the emergence of the Gaza Strip, as people who have followed the events of the last 2 months will surely already be aware of. But so this history, it's a whole number of institutions, the first Israeli trade unions, the Histadrut, which still exists today, as well as the early militias of the Zionist movement, most importantly the Haganah, which then becomes the basis of the Israeli army, are set up in order to make this conquest of labor, this campaign for Hebrew labor possible. The establishment of farms, the establishment of institutions, and the establishment of military organizations that can start developing economic and political models that do away with Palestinians altogether. The work of Nur Masalha here is really important in his kind of tracing of the language of transfer in Zionist literature and politics. And the language of transfer is, of course, the language of the elimination of Palestinians, is how to get the Palestinians out of what will become the future state. Nothing makes that clearer, of course, than the Nakba. And I think this is important because the Nakba is not only something that emerges out of Zionist policy making in the 1940s and the kind of work that's been done on how Zionists prepared the Nakba well before 1947 with kind of different plans for ethnic cleansing, but actually emerges already out of the logic in the late 1910s and 1920s of this labor Zionist movement that becomes increasingly hegemonic and that bases the entirety of its political platform on the necessity to create an economy that is not dependent on the exploitation of indigenous labor. And the Nakba is really the only moment where the Zionist movement is going to get close to making that vision a reality. The expulsion of between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians, the destruction of around 500 villages and urban centers, and the dispossession of huge amounts of land and goods, which I think is talked about less in the kind of telegraphic ways in which we talk about the Nakba usually. So, for example, the kibbutzim that I just mentioned, see their land holdings quadruple between 1947 and 1952. So the land from which Palestinians are expelled is redistributed to the institutions of the labor Zionist movement, one of the most important of them being the kibbutz. And that's again going to be important. I'll say something about it in a second when we think about Gaza. A second kind of example of that is the dispossession of the goods, the wealth, the properties left behind by the Palestinians who are ethnically cleansed during the Nakba. And there's different estimates of that. One of them, which I think is credible, it's based on a number of research done by international institutions in the aftermath of the Nakba. Places the wealth extracted from Palestinians in today's currency at around $17 billion. So huge amounts of extraction of wealth that is integrated into the state in order to make its early development possible. Now, why is all of this important to think about Gaza? Because Gaza, the so-called Gaza Strip, is of course a creation of the Nakba. It's the area of land around Gaza city that is not conquered by the Zionist militias during the Nakba, and in which Palestinians in the south of Palestine are pushed towards in an attempt to concentrate as many Palestinians in as little land as possible, which of course remains the name of the game of Israel's colonial policy up to the present. And so what becomes the Gaza Strip, this area around Gaza, sees its population balloon at the time from 80,000 to 280,000 Palestinians. So 200,000, give or take, Palestinians are pushed into this area that becomes known as the Gaza Strip, and that is cut both from its wider regional trade networks that linked Egypt to the Hijaz on the one hand, and trade networks towards the north, Lebanon, Syria, etc., modern Lebanon and Syria. On the other, as well as from the villages and the towns that made the wider social network of Gaza possible. If people are interested, Salim Tamari's book, what is it, The Mountain Against the Sea, or The Sea Against the Mountain, The Mountain Against the Sea, I think, is a wonderful discussion of this kind of relationship between the coastal cities and their countryside. And so, of course, this is not the kind of I don't have an adequate adjective, but the kind of concentration of Palestinians that we see today, 2.3 million people pushed into 365 square kilometers. But nonetheless, there is a huge explosion of a refugee population in this area that becomes known as the Gaza Strip, which of course creates an internal crisis for those populations themselves, and immediately actually becomes a security crisis or a security threat for the Zionist movement. Because once the Palestinians have been expelled, the question becomes how to keep them expelled. Of course, Palestinians immediately start organizing, either individually or collectively, attempts at return. And so the Israeli state is very early on going to develop different technologies to try to keep the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip concentrated in that area and stop their return. And here, I think two are important that featured so centrally in the 7th of October. And I think to understand that in the kind of long history of Israeli colonialism is to understand the kind of the social, political, and military role that they were created for. So the first one is a series of kibbutzim, these collective farms that are set up in the east of the Gaza Strip. One of the most famous and important ones of them being Nahal Oz, named Nahal after the military brigade that created it. So once the Palestinians had been expelled by the military brigades, those military brigades established a military outpost, which were then turned into outposts for collective farming. And the idea was, of course, a double role, was both how to continue to man the unexistent border, because Israel doesn't recognize its borders, etc., as well as controlling the land at the same time. Nahal Oz is famous also in Zionist historiography because of an important moment in 1956 where the head of the military brigade in Nahal Oz was killed in clashes with Palestinian Fedayeen who were fighting for return. And the story goes, or the Zionist myth goes, I say myth not because I think it's not true, but because it has received a mythical kind of status in Zionist historiography, is that Moshe Dayan, a central figure of the Zionist labor movement, trained by the British to crush the 1936 Palestinian uprising, becomes a central figure in the labor movement, in the military, and then a minister under Golda Meir. Moshe Dayan is in Nahal Oz at the moment where the head of its military organization is killed, a man called Roy Rothberg. The story is that he was there for a wedding and that he asks to be allowed to give the eulogy at Rothberg's funeral. And that eulogy becomes a really kind of central and famous speech of the Zionist movement, in which called the Gates of Gaza. For those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament, Samson rips out the gates of Gaza and throws them away. And Moshe Dayan famously says in this speech, and I just want to read it because I think it captures an ongoing logic of the relationship between the Israeli state and the Palestinians in Gaza. He says in this eulogy for Rothberg, "Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and saw in front of their eyes how we turned the lands and the villages in which they and their forefathers once dwelled into our homeland. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Roy, but from ourselves." Now, of course, the conclusion that Dayan gets to is not that there should be a political solution or that the refugees should be allowed to return, but is that the state will have to live armed and ready to defend the gains of its colonial expansion if it wants to be effective. And in many ways, I think we continue to see that logic, of course, play itself out today. The second kind of technology of control is, on the one hand, you have these kibbutzim in the east. On the other hand, you're going to get the developmental towns in the north, which again are central to the story of today. Places like Sderot and Ashkelon in the north, for example. Others that I'm not thinking about right now, but where Jews from North Africa and the Middle East were first put in what were called integration camps, or the Ma'abarot, and those were then turned into developmental towns. In a sense, a kind of industrial parallel with the kibbutz, which is that instead of being farms, there were industrial towns where entire towns were built around one industry, and where the kind of the Middle Eastern and North African Jews were expected to both guard the land on the one hand and to work and play an economic role on the other. And so that's the kind of status quo post-Nakba, in which this kind of conquest of labor is made as close as a reality as the Israeli state ever got. And the Gaza Strip emerges out of that moment as this kind of place of concentration of the Palestinians that are kicked out of the south, and a whole industrial, agricultural, and urban infrastructure is developed around it in order to keep the Palestinians concentrated in the Gaza Strip. If that was the aim of the labor Zionist movement in its early days, that aim is going to be complicated by Israel's own colonial policy in the years to come. Toufic will talk about this more, but in the mid-1960s, Israel is suffering from labor shortages, from a lack or a limitation of its internal market. And these are not the only, but they are part of the reasons that pushed Israel to launch the 1967 war, expand its borders, capture the whole of historic Palestine, as well as the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert. And from that moment onwards, I think the contradiction that the labor Zionist movement had been set up to avoid opens itself up in all sorts of ways for Israeli policymakers in a way that remains unsolvable, I think, to this day, which is that from that moment on, more land means more Palestinians. The exact kind of logic that the early theoreticians and the early policymakers of the labor Zionist movement had warned against and had proposed transfer, so expulsion and ethnic cleansing as a solution. And so from 1967 onwards, there's an influx of Palestinians into the labor market. And I won't say more because Toufic will talk about it. But I think what's striking is that Israeli policymakers are going to move in a pendulum from the 1960s up to the first Intifada, a pendulum of integration of Palestinians. The first Intifada will point exactly to the worry that labor Zionists had identified, which was to integrate the indigenous population, is to open ourselves up to indigenous rebellion. And so then they're going to move to exclusion again up until the second Intifada. After the second Intifada, they will move back to integration, but without Gaza. And the blockade will be imposed on Gaza in order to keep Gazans excluded, largely because its land is seen as sort of unimportant economically and strategically, whereas the West Bank is, and there are too many Palestinians for too little settlers in the Gaza Strip. And I think that contradiction explodes again on the 7th of October. Israeli policymakers are aware of this contradiction, and they keep sort of expressing their sort of fantasies of elimination in Gaza. So Levi Eshkol, who's the prime minister in 1967, famously says after the conquest of the whole of historic Palestine, he says, perhaps if we don't give them, so the Palestinians in Gaza, enough water, they won't have a choice, referring to them leaving. So this idea of cutting the water in Gaza in order to force people to leave is already one that is being discussed by Israeli policymakers in 1967. During the Oslo period and the period of disengagement or of disentanglement, Yitzhak Rabin famously says, I wish I could wake up one day and find that Gaza had sunk into the sea, right? So that it had just disappeared. So this ongoing kind of desire for Gaza to simply disappear. And in a sense, in 2005, that's also Ariel Sharon's logic, which is to say we can continue colonizing the West Bank and Jerusalem while cutting off Gaza and basically locking 2.3 million people behind barbed wires, regularly bomb them in the so-called mowing the grass campaigns, limiting the amount of food, medicine, construction material, etc., that enters it. And it's basically not our problem. And of course, that solution, quote unquote, can only explode. 2.3 million people held in those conditions can only explode. I say all of this because I think the current moment is still a moment that is defined by that contradiction. And then I'll shut up, I promise, which is that Israel is still confronted with exactly that same problem, which is to say that what is Israel going to do with Gaza? On the one hand, of course, there is the genocidal drive that we are seeing play out in front of our eyes, and that despite Israel's military capability of making it happen, as it clearly is, has real political limitations in terms of what it means for the US's other allies in the region, for the return of the masses in the streets of Cairo, of Amman, of all the capitals of the Arab world, the political price it means for the normalization deals in the region, etc., etc., etc. At the same time, to reestablish control over Gaza would be to turn the clock back to exactly the contradiction that they were trying to deal with, both first in the creation of the Gaza Strip itself, and then in the 2005 pullout of Gaza, which is to say that the Gaza Strip is unholdable, that it's a strategic nightmare for Israel, that it's militarily extremely dangerous for them to try to control that hyper concentration of 2.3 million people in a very small area of land. And so it's not really an option either. And so I think that the kind of the contradiction between more land, less Palestinians that has played itself out since 1967 has exploded on the one hand, but without Israel really having a credible solution to it. I also think obviously that's an important aspect for the solidarity movement, and to put very starkly on the table the question that there is a solution, and that solution is the end of a colonial project that is based on the expulsion, dispossession, and/or elimination of the Palestinian people. And I think that's extremely visible for the world to see today, which is that Israel's solution leads to the kind of genocidal assault that we're seeing now, and that it's a dead end that has to be rejected. And I'll stop there.
Okay, yeah, sorry, there was a technical hitch there. I was muted. I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, so thanks very much, Sai. That was great. Thank you. So our second speaker this evening is Dr. Toufic Haddad, who I've also kind of just previously introduced. Please, Toufic, please go ahead.
I can't unmute.
Okay. Now that's I can hear you now. I can hear you. Thanks.
Oh, you got me? Okay,
yes.
great.
Yes, great.
Okay, let me make sure that I've got everything squared, so I'm actually looking at the microphone and people. Okay, hi folks. Sorry for being late and being a bit, I don't know, the situation here in Jerusalem is not that stable or predictable, and there's a lot going on. So my apologies for not being entirely organized. In any case, I was asked today to try and bring in political economic dimensions to what is taking place in Gaza today. And essentially, before I start, I'd like to actually start by, perhaps building off of where Sai began. He didn't quite begin there, but by posing the question of Gaza itself. Okay, if you remember the way the peace process happened or whatnot, there was always this talk about Gaza being the potential to be turned into Hong Kong or Singapore on the Mediterranean. Of course, this was often used as a kind of economic bait and mythology that what Gaza and the Palestinian state could become. But partly it was built off of the idea that it has, that Gaza is a freestanding, the largest Palestinian city in historical Palestine. Okay, we're talking about a city that has, almost 700,000 people in it, if you want to count the borders of Gaza, city itself, let alone probably 1.5 million in the northern section. And it has access to the sea, okay, in the sense that it is not landlocked like the West Bank, and it could have freestanding independent relation, and it is also located on a geostrategically significant, between basically two major continents, okay, Asia and Africa, and on these major historical trading routes. So there's, and it would also be the first potential port and closest potential port outside of Egypt, if you were to go across the Suez Canal, if that's relevant. In addition to the fact that Gaza, of course, we know, and the whole entire Eastern Mediterranean basin has significant gas reserves. Gas reserves, I will also note, that were actually discovered by the Palestinian efforts to try and develop their state in the making in the 90s, when there was excavation works done with British Gas Company. Basically in 1996, 97, British Gas discovered the existence of gas in these waters, once they happened, once that was discovered, basically Israel froze the potential for them to be developed, and then actually began doing its own excavation for gas in these waters, found gas, as you will all well know, started taking Gaza's gas, and then started extracting their own gas, to say nothing of what happened with the gas between Lebanon and Israel. And of course, there's obviously the broader political economy of this, where, you know, the entire region and this Eastern Mediterranean basin is seen as a significant potential source of fuel for Europe, in light of Europe's dependency on fossil fuels and its need to diversify from its dependency upon Russian-controlled gas or gas networks. And in that regard, it's also worth noting that, you know, the major Western European powers, particularly Germany, you know, when they signed economic treaties with Israel and military treaties. By the way, Germany is the second most important military supplier to Israel, but in this case provided Israel with nuclear submarines. It very much has to do with trying to consolidate Israel as the major military naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean, at least to be able to balance off the Turks and to be able to make sure that there's a significant, reliable Western presence when it comes to be able to policing these waters and how the gas gets in and out and how the trade goes in and out. And we see very quickly in the events of Gaza how the geostrategic issues can come up. I mean, we see this very clear with the Yemen example. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I want to actually start with the principle. The main point that I was making there was the principle that Gaza, even though obviously it's connected to its Palestinian heartland and those trade routes that we were discussing, it also could potentially, simply by virtue of its port existence and its geostrategic location, be a freestanding, successful project were it allowed to develop its own resources and people or whatnot. Now, of course, the story of Gaza is that it's been prevented to do that historically, and that's part of the story of what I'm going to try and say today. But I'm going to start my story basically in 1967. I mean, everybody knows, I think Kasai did a good job of filling people into the fact that, and stressing the fact, which is important, that there is no basis to the Gaza Strip. It doesn't exist as an area with any predefined or pre-existing. Even what we know today of the Gaza Strip, it's not even the Gaza Strip of the armistice line. Salman Abu Sitta 2 days ago on his Facebook showed how Israel stole another 50 kilometers squared from the armistice line, because there was an agreement in 1950 between the Egyptians and the Israelis to try and create a buffer. And once that buffer was created, the Israelis ended up taking the remainder. So even Gaza, even all these areas where all those settlements and military posts were on the periphery of Gaza, most of those are built in the armistice line buffer that Israel took post-48. But our story is going to start in 1967 for today's purposes when it comes to this, because, and there are four sort of distinct stages when I would argue when it comes to the political economy and understanding how these aspects might contribute to understanding around what's taking place in Gaza today. The first stage is basically the stage post-67, where you have a unique situation where Israel, in its triumphalism and its triumphant victory positionality post-67, essentially eliminates all borders, internal borders, from the Sinai all the way to the Golan. Okay, so it's one territorial unit because this is one homeland for the Jewish people. So as far as they're concerned, so it actually ironically means that Gaza, which is 80% refugees, can actually access the Israeli labor market, actually return to their homes and lands. And it's also worth mentioning, most of their homes and lands were not significantly repopulated. All those settlements in the Gaza envelope, all of them are less than 1,000, and that's official figures, okay? Where most of them are like 400 people, and their main purpose, as Sai was speaking, basically had to do with that they were supposed to be forward military positions that had a settler dimension to them, and they were founded under a notion, most of them are founded as under a notion of what's called Nahal settlements. They were supposed to be forward operating settlement positions. And these were built in the 50s, by the way, but simply to take land and also to be forward operating positions. So you would have a civilian/military purpose in these presence in these areas that could say, oh, the Egyptians are coming. So they could somehow inform the center of the country that, you know, the Arabs are coming, whatnot. By the way, it's worth mentioning that this actually ended up being a rather outdated military doctrine for the Israelis, insofar as Israel would develop by the 50s a notion that this kind of static military defense of putting a bunch of 300 Jews, settlers in, you know, on the periphery of Gaza was not actually a very good defensive thing to do. And in fact, Israel, as this small country with not enough, how you would say, with no depth, strategic depth, that is very vulnerable to invasion and potentially even partition, particularly if an invading army is coming from the West Bank or other areas. That as a result, Israel needed to develop forward, aggressive, attacking special forces, and not passive, seated communities that were just waiting for Arabs to come and overtake them. But there was no attempt to reconcile the fact that this old ideologically driven military strategic doctrine was not in congruence with the new military strategies and doctrines that Israel had already developed. And in there also thinking that, okay, Israeli sovereignty is unquestioned and unthreatened, that there's no fear there. We obviously saw that in October 7th, another situation emerged. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to start in 1967, because in 1967, you have, from a developmental perspective, Israel and the economies of the OPT, Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, on a trajectory heading towards what's known as convergence, okay? Basically, the West Bank and Gaza both were very economically weak pre-67, but access to the Israeli economy and to the Israeli labor market basically meant that income started to rise. Palestinians started to learn Hebrew. Their incomes led them to building institutions, including making significant educational advances. In some instances, Palestinian labor became subcontractors for Israeli capital, particularly in small industries like Israel's clothing manufacture, which has largely died out, or at least, it's not died out, it globalized and it went to Southeast Asia or to free industrial zones. Palestinian labor entered the building sector and agriculture sector, which is the main place where the Israelis really needed it. But the more important aspect here is the character of the Palestinian economy under these conditions, under convergence, was one of that Professor Sarah Roy of Harvard has characterized as de-development, okay? This is a particular developmental character, which is not one which is generated, where basically the economic character, the weak lack of synergy, lack of logic, lack of horizontal linkages between Palestinian economic actors and cities is a function not of market forces, but a function of an external force, in this case, the Israelis themselves, actively attempting to break the potential for Palestinian development and synergistic economic alliances to be forged, which includes connections with the outside world, but also includes connections with itself. So all forms of dependency happen vertically within the Palestinian economy, between Palestinians and Israel on top, and their exploitation of the whole system, but no real horizontalism taking place, no surplus taking place, being collectivized, being turned into something productive or whatnot. This is the status that that the OPT economy in general and Gaza in particular is under, one of de-development, where Israel actively works to prevent a Palestinian economy from actually gaining any form of traction. Okay, and in this context, of course, no Palestinian productive industries would really be were invested or developed, although there was small industry, and big capital obviously stayed away. Capital was a coward in this situation, and understandably would be, with the Israeli prerogatives nothing to do with anything economic related to liberal market values. So convergence is stage one. Stage two comes up when basically, as convergence begins to happen, it's not just economic convergence. You're also inevitably, the fear is that it leads to political and institutional convergence, or the fear that and this, of course, is a major threat to Zionist notions and self-identity as Israel being the Jewish democratic state. Okay, so, and this became particularly pronounced, obviously, after the first Intifada, which starts in Gaza, and is basically when you have that quotation where Gazan workers and West Bank workers and the interpermeation and intermixing of Palestinian and Israeli labor and context, in a context where the Palestinians are all of a sudden fighting and throwing stones and organizing and burning things and throwing rocks at settler cars and making it impossible for the Israeli civil administration to function normally. This context creates Israel says, shit, we gotta be careful, we gotta get out of this situation and fast, because it's untenable. And this is actually, you know, many people have recognized this period as the kind of the strength or the height of Palestinian political strength during the first Intifada, basically. But it leads to the desire to separate, okay? The need to separate, to preserve the Jewish democratic state, because the contradiction of 1967 is coming out. The dilemma of Zionism between its Jewish and democratic characters is coming out. If they give citizenship to the Palestinians of West Bank and Gaza, it erodes the quote-unquote Jewish character. If they don't give citizenship, it erodes the democratic character. So their answer is what's known as the Alon Plan. It's an autonomy scenario, a Bantustan scenario, a subcontracted scenario, where basically the Palestinians are taken off of the Israeli books, put under another administration, an administration that is not able to develop itself fully because it doesn't have those free links with the outside world, but is one that at least makes it look, modicum of and elements of it, enable some form of management of the Palestinian question and allows Israel to look to the. So this is the basis of the Oslo peace process and the separate structure that is developed there. Of course, we know later on this develops. This is very clearly the basis of the apartheid reality that comes out, but it is of course camouflaged behind the notions of state building, peace building, genuine political negotiations, etc. Of course, Israel was of course acting independently as it chose, and it never had any real interest in the and in fact was, very, principally opposed to the notion of a genuine Palestinian state taking place in the OPT. But at the very least, the second stage, the stage of what I would call separation, leads to an ability to regulate economic relations more clearly. Before, it was very messy. There was no even statistics about that were publicly available on the OPT economy. They were all hidden and embedded in Israeli statistics on Judea and Samaria, which is a crazy biblical notion. It creates this notion, Oslo creates this notion of kind of, this, it's a simulacra fundamentally, but of a quote unquote Palestinian economy. Okay, bear in mind that the Palestinian economy today is probably no more than 5% of the entirety of Israel's economy. And the entirety of the Palestinian economy is also obviously very controlled and regulated by the Israelis under principles that ensure that it exists under de-development. Okay, and that continued during the Oslo process, but with forms of self-regulation that enabled a local elite to be generated, to monopolize economic opportunities, as well as political opportunities, as well as security ones. And obviously this was key for what Israel was looking for in terms of it needed to have a partner that it could point to be the responsible body to manage Palestinian affairs, because it didn't want it to do it itself, okay? It couldn't do it itself. It needed, but at the same time, this was always constrained by the danger of having a singular authority, meaning that it could organize and revitalize a Palestinian national liberation project. So the Palestinian Authority project and the Oslo project always was constrained by push-pull factors, or centralizing, decentralizing factors. The centralizing factors being that the need to try and make sure that there's one address which deals with the health, security, and educational aspects. The other side of it is that and for things like, and it proves very helpful when you have something like COVID. On the other hand, an over-centralized authority with power to it means that you have a fighting force that wants to, actually develop more than just health and education, but actually wants Palestinian national rights to be moved forward. So this is the Oslo contradiction, and the second period, which is one fundamentality based around separation. Now, of course, what ends up happening is, the Palestinian issue is kind of basically subsumed within this autonomy, Bantustan arrangement that's camouflaged, apartheid, that basically the World Bank and 14 major Western donors are overseeing and pump in upwards of, up till today, over 30 years, maybe $50 billion, the highest amount of aid per capita for a geographic context in the world, okay? Now, of course, this whole scenario explodes and leads to stage 3 with the emergence of the Second Intifada. Okay, the Second Intifada, basically, once it became clear that there was not going to be this whole process was not leading towards statehood, and when Camp David collapses and all this stuff, you have the third wave, which is basically Israel's need to actually attempt to eliminate a viable military resistance against Israel's project and its colonialism and what it's set up in terms of a separation regime, and to eliminate the key cadre and personnel who are actually, which the National Liberation Movement birthed, so to speak, or produced, basically. And so basically, huge amounts of folks are either assassinated or put in prison, including Palestinian Authority leader, PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, in the end of the day, as well as many other historical leaders that were sort of eliminated in this sort of Second Intifada need to purge the nationalist dimension that was attempting to infuse the Palestinian Authority with a national dimension and not just a functionary utilitarian purpose, okay? And then after that had been done, more or less, you had, by 2004, in Gaza in particular, a military resistance ability had developed that was substantial, that was meaningful. And actually here, there's an important dimension which has to do with the different geographical terrains in the West Bank and Gaza. West Bank is actually a much better terrain to actually launch a guerrilla struggle against Israel, the settler project, etc. There's hundreds of settlements, thousands of settlers, Palestinian cities, villages all over the place, okay? And a mountainous terrain, okay? Gaza is entirely flat, okay? So when the Second Intifada actually happens, Israel's strategy, let's not forget there were 21 different settlements in Gaza that were on the key access points to divide Gaza. In fact, by the way, the exact same key access points that they're dividing Gaza on today, all the settlements were on these key points. Basically, the resistance military dynamics that developed during the Second Intifada, because Gaza is flat, are ones where Israel was basically leveling the land to ensure line of sight. with, so if anyone wants to approach with a gun and shoot the settlers or a car that's going to go on the bypass road, you got to be able to see them, hit them first, and you also got to be able to chop up Gaza pretty effectively. And that's what they were doing. As a response to this, Gaza resistance dynamics developed, which are actually much deeper, by the way, and they have a whole nother story to them that goes back to the Egyptian period and pre-Egyptian period even. But in any case, there was the development of, there's a major thunderstorm going on here. I hope I don't lose anything. You see that? So in any case, what am I saying? Lightning hit me. So Gaza developed this ability to hit from afar, first with the mortars, and then later with these primitive rockets, okay? And by the way, it was PLO personnel who actually began to introduce some of this military technology into Gaza. So it wasn't actually Hamas, but once the way was opened up, it was free reign, because the situation in Gaza was so desperate and terrible. The Israelis were always brutal with Gaza. In fact, while doing research on an article that I'm writing on Gaza right now, I discovered that there's an entire monument in Israel on a lookout just outside the Gaza Strip for 70 different paramilitary raids that Israel undertook in Gaza from 1953 to 1956. In 3 years, the Sharon develops his thirst and his skill for killing as a 20-year-old, developing the Unit 101, killing refugees who are trying to return, and then the first attempts of the Fidayeen, basically, in this period. So it's and by the way, there are horrific cases in this period in particular. What Sai mentioned, the quotation from Ro'oi is very important, by the way. But there are also cases of rape that took place. And let us not also forget, you had major massacres taking place, including the 1956 massacre in Khan Yunis and in Rafah, which was the largest massacre to take place in territorial Palestine as a consequence of the conflict with the Zionist movement in Israel before the new waves of killing that have taken place in Gaza in the last 10 years or whatnot. We're talking about 500-600 people killed in Khan Yunis, going house by house, collecting the men and the boys and killing them in public spaces. Massacres that most Palestinians don't even know about, but are super significant to local Palestinian memory in Gaza. And by the way, it's not by chance that Hamas's maqal, or center of power, and the people accused of initiating October 7th are all children of Khan Yunis and children of survivors of these massacres. But I'm going to put this aside because we're still talking about political economy, and the third stage of it, which is that essentially after stage 3 was, so stage 1 was convergence, stage 2 was separation, stage 3 was, okay, eliminate the troublesome national dimension. And essentially what the Americans actually thought they were going to do, they took advice, after the death of Arafat, after the killing of Arafat, there was a clear attempt to sort of repackage the Oslo scenario, and they even had big plans for Gaza. They bought out the settlers. They paid them millions of dollars for their illegal schemes of what they had built in the Gaza Strip. And they said, okay, the Palestinians can take over these Gaza greenhouses, and this is going to be part of their economy, and we're going to do another Hong Kong in Gaza, and blah, blah, blah. The minute they said it, they stopped it from actually being implemented because they were not interested in a development approach for Gaza. The Israelis were not, even though they figured out the World Bank did all the paperwork on how to have a secure economy, and to make sure that if we're taking flowers, if the Gazans are growing flowers or fresh spices or strawberries or whatever, that they could get to market. The World Bank figured it all out, said it's possible, it's doable, it's economic. What lacked was the political decision. Okay, there was no political will to allow Gaza to actually do anything. Okay, and instead, what happened? They tried to package another sort of apartheid Bantustan scenario under Abu Mazen. The elections happened. They failed miserably. Hamas won because Fatah was completely delegitimized, both for the failed Oslo process, but also for the fact that the neo-patrimonial nature of the project led it to having too many internal elites, and they could not field a unified slate for themselves. So Hamas, which did lead a unified slate and had an oppositional approach to Oslo from the very beginning, won the elections in a landslide. We know what happened from there on in. It led on the path to a small civil war that led to basically the divided political, geographical, Hamas-controlled West Bank, Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, and well, they call it the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but it's cynical. Like either you call both of them the Palestinian Authority because they were taking over Palestine, they were elected to a Palestinian legislative council, or you forget that it's a Palestinian Authority to begin with, and you actually say what it is, which is like an institution mobilized and activated by the political power that controls it, which in this case is either Hamas or Fatah. But more important for our purposes here today is to understand that this became a very convenient way for the international community to absolve itself from having the need to push forward on any political process forward. Palestinians are not united. You have Hamas, who's in power now. We can't make a deal with them. They're against the peace process. They're terrorists, all this business. And despite everything that Hamas did to try and change its stripes and make it look different and change its charter and go through all that process of sort of being good Islamists, they were never good enough. And the overall Palestinian polity, aid became an instrument of divide and rule, okay? And a colonial instrument there. So let's also not forget, in this entire arrangement, Israel is, of course, breaks all the primary and secondary boycott that it had suffered under during the Oslo process, before the Oslo process. And it also is able to globalize its capital internationally, accessing the Chinese, the Southeast Asian markets. And let's not forget, Israel was not recognized. The PLO had more countries recognizing it than Israel did before 1993. Okay, so and Israel is able to globalize its capital, and then it's also able to, under the pretext of security and particularly 9/11 and war on terror, Israel clearly begins to develop a niche economic interest based upon its research and development profile that it enjoys with the Americans as the sort of the stable economic, stable military power in the Eastern Mediterranean, the aircraft carrier that cannot be sunk, the watchdog, this sort of Spartan Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Western ally in this area. Israel basically develops its military potential and the political economy of a new military industrial complex to defeat terror and to take on all the challenges of states when it comes to fighting.
Can I ask you to wrap up, because so we have enough time for questions. Can you wrap up, please? Sorry to.
I'm going on too much. Okay, it's clear that there's a lot of but the point is, stage 3 is basically divide and rule. Okay, and then we're about divide and rule, which is the convenient, which has been the situation for Gaza and OPT for since 2006. In this context, for its wrap-up purposes, okay, Hamas, which was the most competent and actually legitimate political entity on the Palestinian scene after the Oslo disaster, basically took the surplus labor power of all the Gazans who had been kicked out of Israel and put on the public payroll. By the way, Gaza public sector payroll is 35% just of the old Fatah people. In the West Bank, it was 18% of the workforce. In Gaza, it was double the size. And then when Hamas came into power, another 10% of the population was put on that. So you've got 45% of the Gaza's population on the public sector payroll down there. Surplus people, surplus graduates who have no job, everybody poor, everybody existing on handouts and food. Hamas was able to successfully take that surplus, you know, the extraneous population that nobody needed or wanted from a Western Israeli perspective, and channel that towards towards a political, infrastructural, developmental project internal to the Gaza Strip that was not visible to the external powers who were monitoring it. And this is, of course, a lot of it was based upon the tunnel economy. But what are we talking about? We are talking about the fact that Gaza built a city under a city. It built more than 500, by its own admission, 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. More territory than the entire Western donors, Zeffatu, what's it called? Paved in above ground. Gaza built more of it below ground, as well as having a military industrial side of it, where it included weapons production. Okay, bringing in the expertise that they had, which included everything from aeronautical dimensions to, I mean, I don't know if we can believe them, but, you know, like apparently they even took Wikala, what is it? Like the Russians gave them the ability to do Kalashnikov bullets, you know, and to produce them locally in Gaza. Now, basically, after October 7th, to wrap it up, October 7th proved and showed the potential of Gaza, of Hamas's sagacious leadership. Okay, it's the fact that it understood that we should not necessarily get involved in every episode of conflict, that we need to accumulate our strengths and we need to work together, and essentially conducted a military infantry maneuver that had never been observed before, but was simply maximizing simple, you know, discipline and principles that everyone had, and that with basic intention and military knowledge you could have done. And now the story is coming out that there was plenty of evidence that it was underway, that the Israelis kept on talking about it. And to be honest, the main reason why the Israelis couldn't see it coming was apparently nothing less than colonial arrogance, racism, and also sexism, because apparently all the Israeli women spotters who were monitoring the Israelis, the Hamas doing all this training, were all these women telling their superiors, well, Hamas is, you know, learning how to break down the fence, and they're learning how to take out a tank, and they're learning how to do this and that. And the guy said, yeah, they'll never do it. They can never do it. They're just Arabs who just, like, you know, pompous. So, you know, speak above their britches. And that's really what happened. So now we have entered the eliminationist phase of the situation, which is obviously very dangerous, and which brings together where Sai was. It's a big battle. I don't know more what to say, but what I do know is that, well, I don't know. I'm not going to make predictions about anything, but we do know that I think the fact that Hamas was already able to channel and create and direct a form of political economy and organization to its society that already was independent and largely invisible between quotation marks, means that those factors are still there. And as far as we can see, there's still strong elements of command and control and beyond. So even though what is happening is incredibly dangerous, and for every reason we should fear and take very realistically when they talk about a Gaza Nekba, because and that could have maximalist or minimalist versions of it, and all of which are horrendous. At the end of the day, Israel is entering this battle on a totally different, disorganized, poor political footing than the Gazans are. And I guess we'll see where that goes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Toufic. Thanks. That was great. Okay, so now we still have time for questions. Please type if you prefer. You can type questions or comments in the chat, and I will read them. Or you can simply kind of raise your hand to ask the question directly. So please go ahead. Well, Rima, did you want to ask something, or? Well, I can ask something to get things going if while people kind of collect their thoughts. Yeah, first of all, I guess a question for Sai. First of all, is that Sai early in his talk, Sai mentioned that Zionism was from the outset explicit about its own status as a colonial project, but it's only relatively recently that the colonialist character of Zionism has become a contested issue. Could you very quickly say, when and why, the Zionism status as a colonial project began to be contested, and whether this was kind of something the Israelis themselves started to kind of to deliberately, camouflage or downplay this aspect for ideological reasons, and was it in the 1970s or later, or just if you could please develop this, because it's a very interesting point, I think.
Should I answer straight away, or are we taking a few at the same time?
If anyone else,
I think
yes, Nadia, please go ahead.
Hi. Okay, thanks. Thanks both. I mean, this is really great. And I just want to comment on this kind of the last point that Toufic made, which I think is something really worth discussing, in the sense that you're kind of saying it's the opposite. So precisely because there was a project on the side of Hamas for whatever, it's not really state building at this point, but in a sense, kind of developing an economy, developing, when you put 45% of the population on the public sector, you're spending into the population, right? I mean, actually, this country here had the same situation, even more of a percentage before the crisis a few years ago, right? There's a huge number of families that relied on the public sector here. So I mean, it's very interesting that you posit as there was a developmental aspect, and what they were facing is a de-developmental logic because of the kind of colonial logic of political economy that kind of drives the Zionist state. And this is, I mean, it's almost like the only way I can think about it is that what's happening now is almost kind of an implosion, if not kind of a complete kind of a show of something that people have been trying to think about for a long time, about what it means to have a colonial situation within a general kind of capitalist social logic, in the sense that, the colonial situation is premised on this kind of, dependency, but not in the simplistic form, right? There's something different about usual dependency theories in this context, right? It seems like what you're saying is that it exposes a different logic to simple dependency in terms of extraction, like in terms of the logic that, that there's a central economy that extracts from another rentier state or whatever economy, and, but rather what you're saying here is that there's an actual, de-development versus development is not the same dependency logic. I mean, I don't know if you can comment on this, both of you, actually. It seems like there's something different in the logic of what you're proposing here than what we usually take to be the problem, right? In a sense that there's no even horizon of the possibility of a sovereignty of a nation, of a state, but yet there is this kind of ongoing economic process. And it's a very interesting antagonism between, you know, the colonial state and the attempt to develop on the side of Hamas. Sorry, that was a really long, it's a comment. I mean, I would really like to, I mean, it seems like it poses a serious question to a simplistic account of how one would have considered things in terms of, you know, classical theories of dependency, I suppose. I don't know if I'm being, yeah, maybe I don't know what you guys can, yeah.
Look, I mean, thanks for both of those questions. I'm a little bit nervous to say exactly when the Israelis stopped talking about colonialism. I'm not sure when to put the date on it. I have documents up until the late 50s, including a fascinating newspaper, an Israeli newspaper that used to be published in French called L'Information, that has a special issue in 58 celebrating the 10 years of Israeli statehood and the special bonds with the French state, in which it has articles discussing the advancement of colonialism and it's of colonization, and it's talking about the kibbutzim. So in 58, they're still talking about the advancing of colonialism internally. And they very explicitly in the editorial link it with the French struggle in Algeria. So they say, you know, much as the French are struggling in Algeria, etc. And so I would be hesitant to give a year, but it seems to me that that's what ends up changing, which is that as long as Israel is a colonial state amongst colonial states, and of course, that's why the Zionists are colonialists. They're European middle-class thinkers in the late 19th and earlier 20th century. They think like Europeans. They solve internal socio-economic problems by expanding, you know, dispossession and control abroad. And as long as that remains the kind of the Central European or Western function, I think the Israelis are very open about their project. I think that what changes is, of course, the rise of decolonization on the one hand, and the shift from Britain and France to the United States and the USSR on the other. And so that the kind of it's the era of the nation state and the kind of overt language of colonialism increasingly becomes a problem internationally. The rise of the new left, like all of these, you know, international solidarity, all of that. So the last kind of good stuff, quote unquote, I have is the late 50s. I would be hesitant about when exactly it stops, but I think that timeline makes sense. I mean, I'll let Toufic say more on the second question. I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is that I think we have to think of colonialism as first and foremost a method of accumulation, right? It's a form of accumulating land, resources, labor, etc. And it does so either externally through military control or internally through the development of a settler population. And when it does so through the development of settler population, the character itself of, you know, what we think of as settler and native is a structural imposition of which populations can participate in the accumulation and which populations are to be dispossessed. And so that the kind of the logic of development and de-development, I think, can only ever function in one direction, because the very kind of legal basis of the settler colonial project is the fact that Israelis have collectively the right to dispossess, a right that they continue to exert on a population which is marked with the right, and there's lots of kind of literature on this now, is marked with the right only to be dispossessed, and that dispossession take lots of different forms. We've talked about different, you know, whether it's elimination, expulsion, genocide, occupation, exploitation, etc. There's lots of forms in which it takes place, but I think there's a red thread that runs throughout it, which is that logic of an accumulative process, which is, of course, not only internal, but also the lots of different ways in which Israel facilitates broader regional networks of accumulation, etc. But that, to me, is the kind of the structuring logic of economic relations within Palestine and within settler colonial regimes in general.
Thanks.
I guess I'll add to that. I mean, Zionist settler colonialism is very particular, and I think every colonialism is. So it needs to be studied in specificity. And in this case, Israel and the Zionists had ideological imperatives that developed around concepts of Hebrew labor and Hebrew markets. This is the way they termed it in pre-state days. So it's not a classic example of colonial, let's say, extraction and exploitation of a local population, like you might see in the latifundio type model of South America or other parts of Africa or whatever. It was based on exclusion from the beginning, and it was based on eliminationism. Yeah, and so it was that kind of colonialism. And here, Gershon Shafir has some of the. It's worth looking at some of his work because he talks about the different settler colonial models and the affinities that the Zionist project has with the eliminationists of New Zealand and Australia and North America, which is different than the Indonesian, for instance, the Dutch in Indonesia. So in any case, this lends itself, this is also important because the colony or the ex-colony that's developed, leads to underdevelopment, as let's say, or these theories in development of the center, periphery, and extraction, and the creation of this elite that's benefiting, although the majority of the country is just screwed, stuck in a mine or pulling out coffee beans or whatever, and but that's different than de-development. It's not dependency. It's de-development. I mean, by virtue of reality, I don't know what the Latin word would be. Yes, Palestinians are dependent because they don't have means of sustenance of their own in many cases, because they're prevented from water and from markets and from land and these kinds of things. But it's any time that Palestinians are able to exercise competitive economic practices vis-a-vis the Israelis, or synergistically create profits and surplus by themselves that or any significant level, they need to be stopped, basically. And that external intervention is what's going on here. I think what's interesting here is that the models that the West and the Israelis adopted around they knew what they were doing, obviously, and they knew there was no sovereignty, and they knew it's nonsense, this stuff of talking about Gaza turning into Hong Kong or whatnot. But they still thought they could reverse engineer a political economic elite that would be subservient. That model, that very neoliberal economic mindset, which basically is, believe that markets and money and opportunity could be given to these elites who could dominate this local little market in the different area A's of the West Bank and Gaza, that would be sufficient, and that you could leverage basically an increasing economic dependence and strength, and get that to displace a historic political position for national liberation. That's the developmental logic that they were shooting for, okay? And the truth is, it fails, and it fails on both the West Bank and Gaza, okay? It's not just Gaza. In Gaza, it fails very badly because there's way too many contradictions to it. There's way too many people who are out of place in it. The Fatah is a mess in Gaza. It almost descends into civil war inside Fatah after Arafat dies, because the regulator of the neo-patrilineal arrangement, Arafat, is gone. So you have Dahlan against the Shaja'iyya boys, against the Khan Yunis boys, against, and that's the chaos that actually creates the ground, the Fatah chaos, that creates the ground for Hamas to come in as a savior, as a single security force, and say, look, all this Fatah, infighting stuff, that's over, that's khalas, and we're not going to tolerate, we can't tolerate fratricidalism within Fatah, and you're just ridiculous exploitation of this local scene. You're just a bunch of gangsters, basically. But it also fails in the West Bank too. And I think the problem is you have in both cases, the West and the Israelis maintaining a kind of arrogant colonial approach whereby there's like, oh yeah, we created this local elite that in the end, they're not going to fight us. And in the end, we can win out of it. In Gaza, it was pronounced, right? And in fact, by the way, also you had Palestinians contributing to this idea that like, oh yeah, you know, like whatever, Hamas just, after they took power, they just became some kind of, yeah, another local elite, and they were just bullying everybody locally. All of this is not to say you make any apologies for the way, you know, both regimes, Hamas and Fatah in the West Bank, you know, necessarily rely upon trying to exploit, create a monopoly position, you know, exploit the economic opportunities of the infrastructure of it, et cetera. What Hamas needed to do is they actually needed to create an entire new infrastructure, because the existing infrastructure above ground was basically dominated by the Oslo logic and personnel and actors. You know, you couldn't, there's only a few very limited, you know, ways in which things can go in and out of Gaza, you know, and, you know, certainly if you're going to do import, export or something, or people. And so, and that was dominated by above ground powers that be. So they created a total alternative thing. And it relied upon, no question yet, you know, I mean, like, you had hundreds of Palestinians who died in trying to build tunnels and things like this. And in fact, the one academic article that I have, like in peer-reviewed journal, is basically like around the question of the infrastructure, insurgent infrastructure. It's about the Gaza tunnels, and it starts off like it's published in 2018. If anyone's interested, it starts off talking about how Ismail Haniyeh had to go to a local mosque in 2017 to basically try and calm the people down, because 7 kids from the kids, I mean, teenagers or whoever they were, died in a tunnel collapse, which was a common occurrence that was taking place at the time. There was no safety regulations. This is Gaza in the end of the day. And he said, listen, don't worry. They didn't die in vain. They died because we have a bigger project, because we're moving forward on it. It will not be in vain. What we are doing, by the way, he says an amazing quotation. He says, we are building double the amount of tunnels that exist in Vietnam. He says it in 2017. Okay, so they studied the Vietnamese model that actually was out there, and particularly what's known as Chu Chi City, where you had 250 kilometers worth of tunnels. Hamas indeed, just 2 years ago, Sinwar acknowledged we had over 500. He had over 500 kilometers underground. So I don't know. I mean, dependency, not dependency. I think what's interesting is they expected to get the elite formation that would exist in underdevelopment, but because the situation really was de-development, they were never able to secure the deal with that bought out elite. You know, that they still are, elites still might have a few bank accounts in Switzerland, but that doesn't mean that they're entirely, well, we'll see. I don't want to make any more comments. I've already said enough.
Any other questions or comments? Well, so be good if we had one more question. I think it seems well, I guess, okay, Rima.
Yes, I have about 15 or 20 questions, but I'll try to keep them to one. I wanted to ask about I mean, we often talk about the situation in Israel today, the crisis mainly as one of democracy, the protest, etc. But we don't link that too much with the financial crisis and economic crisis in Israel. So I wanted to hear a bit from you about how this links up with, I mean, the huge cost of this war as well, of course, which means plugging the Israeli economy into a global economy of, you know, funding, and we see all these states rallying up to arm Israel and fund it. But I wanted to think about the internal contradictions within the Israeli population, the Israeli society, and what this means in terms of the settler colonial project in Palestine. So looking at the other side of the coin.
Yeah, thanks, Rima. I mean, I think that issue is the only thing that explains the kind of growth of internal conflict inside of Israeli society for the last 15 years or something, post Second Intifada, is that there's a lot of kind of hope among certain parts of the international kind of commentariat every time there are kind of developments inside of Israel, that either the question is about the oppression of Palestinians, or that even if it isn't, at some point it will become about that. And it never is, nor does it become about that. It's about what you identify, which is that there is a growing and has been growing since the kind of it starts in the mid 1980s and really takes off by the late 1990s. There's a huge concentration of capital in a very small group of families. A process that is largely facilitated by the United States, and in many ways, I think there's question marks about how much it makes sense to talk about an independent Israeli capital. These networks of private Israeli capitalists are totally integrated with their American counterparts, either through joint ownership or through Israeli companies that are that go live on American and not on Israeli markets. Even when they're independent Israeli companies, they largely come out of the high-tech sector, which is the privatization of American technology. Israel is the only country in the world that has the right to privatize American technology acquired through the buying of weapons. So you get lots of ex-Israeli generals who leave the army from the 1980s onwards and who set up these kind of new technology, so-called research and development. It's not really research and development, it's extraction and reselling companies after having served in kind of the special weapons or special surveillance units. They turn that into kind of private companies, etc. And at the same time, the kind of what was a very expansive welfare state is privatized and rolled back. And so Israel goes from being a company, goes from being interesting slip, a state that is amongst the most equal for its Jewish population in the OECD to one of the most unequal. It kind of hovers at the bottom of the kind of the bottom 5 in the OECD. And so there's huge social disparity, which also breaks the social contract in Israel. And I think that's really what a lot of these social struggles are on, which the social contract was will participate in the expansion of colonialism, will staff the occupation, will serve, etc. But in exchange, we have access to houses, jobs, welfare, and a Western standard of life. And of course, in many ways, that is the Western standard of life now. But the social contract is broken, which is that what you have in a lot of these demonstrations, whether it was the housing demonstration in 2011 or the more recent one, is that the language of it is not at all a challenge to Israel's colonial project. It's about saying we serve our role, we do our part, why is the state not doing its own? Why is it not redistributing the colonial loot and the loot of its relationship with imperialism appropriately downwards to the rest of the Jewish population in Israel? So I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, as other settler colonial states, and it's maybe a discussion for another time, but I disagree with Toufic that the Israeli project is particular in that sense. I think it's extremely similar to a lot of others. But I think one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which settler colonial regimes manage to stabilize their internal social contradictions is by expanding colonial rule. And so one of the things that the settlements do is that they give people access to cheaper housing. It's highly subsidized by the state. Rent is less expensive. The price of housing is less expensive. There's lots of existing welfare for large families, for children, etc., that don't exist inside of the Green Line anymore. They exist in some places, by the way. For example, there's still tax rebates for people who go and live in the kibbutzim next to Gaza. But so that these function as a way to encourage the poor not to kind of struggle internally, but to move into East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and to expand the colonial project. In 2011, the only thing that came out of the large housing protest in Israel was promises to expand settlement construction in East Jerusalem, primarily a little bit in the West Bank as well. But so that the settler project is both fought for inside of Israel, who gets to benefit from it, and there is a continuous back and forth, which I think you can sort of read in parallel with the back and forth about should we exclude the Palestinians or exploit them, which works hand in hand with is it the labor movement or capital that benefits most in the redistribution of the colonial loot, and on the other hand, it allows to kind of weaken internal contradictions by expanding the colonial project and colonial dispossession. And so I think there's a kind of a direct relation, but very much on the basis that basically everybody agrees on the fact that the colonial project continues. I mean, the big disagreement over the last year wasn't about the occupation even. The big disagreement was over should there be a different legal system maintained between the two sides of the Green Line, or should we just apply the same legal system everywhere and announce ourselves as the owners of the land, etc., with the incredible scenes of seeing demonstrators saying, if we do that, they will take us all to The Hague. So, you know, the problem wasn't the crimes committed that would get you to The Hague, would be the legal system that would stop masking the fact that you are committing those crimes in another kind of legal jurisdiction than your own. So I think a lot of, I hesitate to say always, but the vast majority of social struggle in Israel is about the particular organization of the colonial project rather than its nature, which is virtually unchallenged. There are very, 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 very small what's it called? When it's not the rule, it's exceptions. There are very, very small exceptions. But that's what they are, very, very small exceptions.
If I could just make a couple of more comments on that, Ray. And
sure, go ahead.
Well, they're not taking too much more time, but I think what's important to pay attention to here relates to this particular political economy that emerged out of the research and development wing of the military industrial complex, that the American Israeli military industrial complex, basically. Okay, so all those spin-offs that got into the NASDAQ and, you know, the unicorns, and the Israelis basically privatizing all this and selling all this security technology to, you know, whatever, to Kashmir and to whatever, Myanmar, you know, like every horrific scenario you'll find Israeli weapons or technology or whatever. I'm not here to talk about how terrible it is. It goes without saying, it's weapons dealing, they're masters of war. The more important aspect here is that in October 7th, a huge military industrial complex got a big bad bruise on its eye. So if you had bought an Israeli surveillance regime and a nice wall and consultants and cameras and remote control, and just a month before October 7th, all of a sudden you saw a bunch of refugee kids, take it out like they're playing computer games. It was a huge blow to the military. I don't know what you would call that. Like, I don't know, the advertising potential to that whole thing. Now, okay, put that to the side. Those are big vested multi-billion-dollar interests. Okay, the wall itself cost a couple of billion. I can't remember. Whatever. The real point here, though, is the fear is that the current war will be used to not just revitalize those interests, to say, look, don't sell yet. We actually have some great technology that can do even more and worse and more damaging things. And don't worry, we got, surveillance drone. Israel was doing well after what happened in Armenia and the ethnic cleansing of Artak. The Armenian section of what now the Azerbaijanis took over, basically, Israeli technology was seen as the decisive factor in allowing for the Azerbaijani victory, and what ultimately led to the expulsion of the Armenians from those areas. And it all went under the radar for most people because it was like, everyone's like, yeah, whatever, poor Armenians, whatever, that was the terrible situation that we actually witnessed. Okay, so in general, Israel and its drones were doing well there. However, October 7th was a hit. And now you'll see, for instance, Israel, what is it doing in Jenin? It's already using these loitering drones that are not just like, we're not talking about like big, we're talking about like, what's that Arnold Schwarzenegger movie? It's a really sci-fi kind of dimension of a much smaller drone that comes into my room and decides to blow me up, right? That's where they're going with this, okay? And so the fear is to use October 7 war, or whatever you would call what's going on, this genocide, as a theater for more performance of the Israeli military-industrial complex to regain their lost masculinity and their shareholding, basically, so people don't dump. By the way, did people see that? This is a fascinating, crazy thing, that came out in Haaretz today, where they said that there was suspicious sales of Israeli tech stock just before October 7th, basically claiming that there may have Hamas or somebody might have been invested in these Israeli stock companies and then shorted them. Shorting being the economic strategy where you bet against a stock and made billions of it, according to them. Yeah, someone says, yes, I read that. Yes, good, Nadia. Anyway, the other thing that's missing from this entire conversation is actually the G20, the plans that came out of G20, and the fact that Israel was seen to be this, the West, after especially Arab uprisings and blah, 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 the need to consolidate this reliable Western partner in this Eastern Mediterranean, became very important. So I started talking about the gas thing, but at the end of the day, after the G20 meeting, you had a major announcement where basically the US was talking about the development of a strategic trade, fuel, informational corridor from India all the way to Israel, with Israel being the font that feeds Europe. And this too is in a deep sort of informing sense towards certainly the Western support, I would say. Although, right now, I think things are obviously being driven by strong, need for performing vengeance and etc. But in the end of the day, the results of the Arab Revolution were showing, and the fact that it's a continual process, show that they have few allies in the region, and Biden needs to, and the US and the West need to have a reliable person in this area, because Arabs are getting out of control. So anyway, yeah, I won't say more. So I think that just needs to be a little bit a part of the conversation as well.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Toufic. Thanks, both of you. Thanks, Sai, for two extremely illuminating, informative talks. I think everyone learned an immense amount. So thanks very much for both of you, and thanks everyone for coming in and attending. And we hope to see you for our final session, which will be announced. Which I don't think it's. I'm not sure if it's Thursday. Rima, is it Thursday or early next week, the final session?
Next Monday, the 11th.
Monday the 11th. Okay, our final session, Monday the 11th. Thanks, Toufic. Thanks, Sai. Good night. Good night.